The air in Fairhope was thick with an unspoken tension, a pressure that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came with peace. It was the silence of fear, of people too afraid to speak out, too worn down by injustice to believe that change was possible. But on this day, something was different. Something was shifting. The small-town diner, usually a place of warmth and familiarity, felt unusually charged. Conversations hushed as a video played on multiple phone screens, the bright glow illuminating grim, disbelieving faces. The footage was damning. Two police officers, Jack Peterson and Mark Lewis, their badges gleaming under the streetlights, towering over a black teenager who cowered against a brick wall. Their voices were sharp, filled with unwarranted authority, their hands too quick to shove, to intimidate. And then came the words, the ones that turned stomachs, that set hearts racing in fury. You people need to learn your place. The diner fell into a weighted silence. The phrase wasn't new, not to the people of Fairhope. It had been muttered for years, disguised in different forms, hidden behind false smiles. But this time, it was caught on camera. This time, there was proof. At a corner booth, William Carter watched the video with a clenched jaw. The coffee in front of him had gone cold, forgotten in the wake of the storm brewing in his mind. He wasn't just another bystander. He was Fairhope's newly appointed police chief. And now, the moment he had been dreading and preparing for had arrived. A waitress, Emily, approached cautiously, her voice a whisper. "What are you going to do?" William exhaled slowly. "What I should have done the moment I walked into that station." His gaze swept across the diner, meeting the eyes of those who had suffered in silence for too long. Some looked at him with cautious hope, others with the wary doubt of people who had learned not to trust too easily. He understood their skepticism. Fairhope had seen men like Jack and Mark run unchecked for years, wielding their authority like a weapon, protected by a system that had allowed them to thrive. But William had promised himself, and this town, that things would change. No more excuses. No more silence. As he rose from his seat, the scrape of his chair against the floor seemed deafening in the hushed room. He left his untouched coffee behind and stepped outside, inhaling deeply. The cool morning air did nothing to quiet the storm raging inside him. It was time to put an end to this. The morning sun bathed Fairhope in golden light, but there was no warmth in the air, only the chill of anticipation. The town was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. As William walked toward the police station, his steps were heavy with purpose. He wasn't just carrying the weight of his badge. He was carrying the burden of every person in Fairhope who had been silenced, every voice that had been dismissed. This wasn't just about Jack and Mark anymore. It was about the culture of fear they had created, the system that had protected them for so long. The station was buzzing when he arrived. Officers whispered in clusters, their eyes darting toward him as he entered. The tension was thick, a storm gathering on the horizon. Some of them had seen the video, and those who hadn't would soon. There was no covering it up this time, no brushing it aside. As William pushed open the door to the main briefing room, all conversation ceased. Every officer turned toward him, some with expressions of curiosity, others with the wary hesitation of men who knew what was coming. Jack and Mark sat at the table, acting as if nothing had happened. Jack leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, his smirk lazy and defiant. Mark sat beside him, less confident, but still holding on to the false belief that they were untouchable. William stepped forward, placing both hands on the table between them. His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. "You've both seen the video." Jack's smirk barely faltered. "And?" William didn't blink. "And you're done here?" The room felt like it had lost all oxygen. The other officers stiffened, glancing at each other with uncertainty. Jack sat forward now, his smirk replaced by something colder. "You think you could just walk in here and—" "Yes," William interrupted, his voice sharp. "That's exactly what I think." He reached into his pocket and placed two pieces of paper on the table. Termination notices, their names printed in bold letters. Mark swallowed hard. "William, let's not be rash." "Rash?" William's voice remained even, but the force behind it was unmistakable. "You think this is rash? Do you know how many complaints have been made against you? How many people have suffered because of your so-called policing? Jack's face turned red, anger simmering beneath the surface. You're making a mistake. No, William said, voice unwavering. The mistake was letting you wear that badge for as long as you did. A long silence followed. Jack's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't speak. He knew there was no fighting this. The video had stripped them of their protection, exposed them for what they truly were. William stepped back, turning your badges and weapons. Now, for the first time, Jack and Mark hesitated. The power they had clung to so desperately was slipping through their fingers, and they could do nothing to stop it. Slowly, Mark reached for his belt, unclipping his holster. His hands trembled slightly as he placed his gun on the table, the sound echoing through the silent room. Then, with a deep breath, he removed his badge and set it beside the weapon. Jack followed a moment later, but not before glaring at William, his eyes filled with resentment. He slammed his badge down hard, the metal clinking against the wood. But there was no defiance in the act, only the bitter realization that his reign was over. As they stood, the room remained still. Other officers exchanged glances, some relieved, others ashamed that they had never spoken up before. No one tried to defend them. No one stood in their way. Jack and Mark walked toward the door, their steps slow, heavy with humiliation. As they passed through the hallway, staff members averted their eyes. The respect they had once demanded was gone. When they stepped outside, the town was waiting for them. A small crowd had gathered, residents who had heard the news, who had come to witness the moment that had once seemed impossible. Their faces held no anger, no shouts of rage, just quiet judgment, disappointment, the weight of years of mistreatment settling upon the two men who had once ruled this town through fear. Among them stood Emily, the young waitress from the diner. Her eyes locked on Jack and Mark as they walked away, heads bowed. When they finally disappeared from sight, she turned to William, her voice trembling with emotion. Justice has finally been served. William didn't smile, didn't let relief overtake him. Instead, he met her gaze with quiet determination. Justice isn't just about removing them, he said. It's about rebuilding trust. That's the real work. Emily gave him a small, hopeful nod. This town has waited a long time for someone like you. William didn't respond. He simply turned and stepped back inside the station, knowing that this was only the beginning. Jack and Mark were gone, but the scars they left behind still needed to be healed. And that would be the hardest battle of all. The sun was setting over Fairhope, casting long shadows across the town that had just taken its first real breath of freedom. The removal of Jack and Mark wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The people had waited too long for change, and now they stood at the threshold of a new era. Inside the police station, William leaned against his desk, exhaustion pressing down on him. The day had been long, and the battle wasn't over. Removing two officers wouldn't erase the years of fear and injustice. There were still others within the department who had looked the other way, who had let corruption thrive. Trust wasn't something that could be restored overnight. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Emily stepped in, her usual warm smile replaced with something softer, more serious. She held 2 cups of coffee, offering him one as she sat down across from him. I figured you could use this, she said. William accepted the cup with a grateful nod. Thanks. It's been a long day. Emily studied him for a moment before speaking. People are talking, you know. Some are hopeful, others not so sure. They've been let down before. William sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I know, and I don't blame them. She set her cup down. So, what now? You got rid of the worst of them, but Fairhope's problems didn't leave with them. William exhaled slowly. We rebuild, but not just the police department, the whole town. People need to see that things are actually changing, not just hear promises. It's going to take time. Emily nodded thoughtfully. People want to believe, William. They just don't know if they can. William leaned forward, his hands clasped together. Then I'll show them. The next morning, Fairhope woke up to something different. There was no sudden miracle, no instant transformation, but there was movement. At the police station, William gathered the remaining officers, standing before them like a man preparing for war. Not a war of violence, but one of accountability. He made it clear, things were changing, and anyone unwilling to be part of that change could walk out the door right then. A few did, but others stayed, uncertain, yet willing to listen. That was a start. Across town, residents gathered outside the town hall for an open forum, the first of its kind. People who had been silenced for years stepped up to the microphone, their voices shaking but strong. They spoke about the fear they had lived with, the injustices they had endured. For the first time, they were being heard. And for the first time, the town's leadership was listening. At the diner, where gossip usually spread like wildfire, the conversation was different. People weren't just talking about what had happened. They were talking about what could be. Ideas for community programs, town cleanups, mentorship for young kids. There was a spark, small but growing. Emily watched it all unfold from the counter, wiping down the same spot on the counter absent-mindedly. She caught William's eye as he walked past the window, and he gave her a nod, silent acknowledgement that they were moving in the right direction. As the days passed, efforts to heal Fair Hope continued. William implemented new training programs at the station, ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. He worked closely with community leaders, attending town meetings, walking the streets to talk with residents. He wasn't just enforcing change from behind a desk, he was living it. But change didn't come without resistance. There were those who still clung to the old ways, who resented the shift in power. William received threats. Anonymous notes slipped under his door, warnings muttered under breath. But he had expected this. Fear didn't fade easily, especially when it had been the foundation of a system for so long. One night, as he locked up the station, he found a spray-painted message across the front doors. "You'll never change this town." Instead of anger, William felt something else, determination. He stepped back, looked at the words, and then did something unexpected. He picked up a cloth and started wiping the paint away himself. Moments later, a young boy from the neighborhood joined him, followed by an elderly man, then Emily, then more and more residents. By the time the message was gone, the people of Fair Hope stood together, side by side, proving that they had already changed. The winds of change swept through Fair Hope, slow but steady, carrying the promise of a better future. The scars of the past were still there, etched into the walls of buildings once stained by injustice, whispered in the cautious voices of those who had suffered for too long. But something was different now. There was movement. There was hope. William stood in the heart of the town, watching as life returned to places that had once felt lifeless. The square, once a place of quiet oppression, now bustled with people. Children ran freely, their laughter ringing out against the backdrop of repainted buildings. Volunteers worked together, planting trees along the sidewalks, repainting old benches, and breathing new life into a town that had once seemed stuck in time. Emily approached him, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one, a knowing smile on her face. "Looks different, doesn't it?" she asked, glancing around at the activity. William took a sip, nodding. "Yeah, but it's just the beginning." She studied him, her expression thoughtful. "You did this, you know. You gave them something to believe in again." William shook his head. "No, they did this. I just reminded them that change was possible. The transformation wasn't just happening on the surface. Inside the police department, change was taking root. The officers who had chosen to stay under William's leadership were adapting to a new way of doing things, one that involved transparency, accountability, and actual service to the people. Training programs were put in place, community meetings became a regular occurrence, and for the first time in years, people didn't look at the police with fear. They looked at them with cautious hope. William made it a point to be present, not just as a chief, but as a member of the town. He walked the streets, checked in on local businesses, and spoke with residents, not about crime, but about their lives, their struggles, their dreams. It wasn't easy. There were still skeptics, still those who believed this was all temporary, that Fair Hope would slip back into its old ways the moment no one was watching. One evening, as William was locking up his office, he received a message, a simple note left on his desk. "Trust isn't given, it's earned." He held the piece of paper between his fingers, letting the weight of those words sink in. It was true. One victory didn't erase years of betrayal, but he was willing to put in the work. Days turned into weeks, and Fair Hope continued its slow but determined march forward. The town square, once a symbol of silence, now became a space of unity. People gathered there in the evenings, not out of fear, but out of a desire to connect. Local artists painted murals that reflected the town's history, not just the struggles, but the resilience. One particular evening, an older man named Mr. Carter stood beneath a newly planted tree, speaking with a group of teenagers. His voice, once drowned out by a town that refused to listen, was now met with nods of understanding. Across the way, Sarah and a group of women arranged fresh flowers around the town fountain, their conversations filled with purpose. Nearby, a young officer helped repair a broken fence in the park, chatting with the kids who had once been afraid to even approach someone in uniform. William took it all in, standing at the edge of the square, watching as Fair Hope came back to life. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But tonight, as the last rays of sunlight bathed the town in gold, he knew one thing for certain. Fair Hope's heart had changed forever. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And it takes people willing to stand up, to keep fighting, to never stop believing that change is possible. Fair Hope proved that when a community refuses to be divided, when it chooses unity over fear, transformation can happen. What do you think of William's journey? Have you seen a positive change in your own community? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. See you in the next video.